They were called missionaries. But what they did in that chapel made demons weep. Now listen closely. There are stories so dark. They're not forgotten. They're buried, deep, not just beneath the soil, but beneath layers of official silence, spiritual corruption, and generational fear. This is one of them. The Grayson family didn't just kill. They constructed a system. A machine of death, draped in scripture, polished with prayer, and powered by the faith of the innocent. You're not watching this by accident. Some part of you, buried deep beneath the noise, wants the truth. Not the Sunday school version. Not the textbook edits. You want to know what really happened in the hills of eastern Oregon, so I'm going to show you. But once you hear it, you don't go back, because this isn't a ghost story. This is a blueprint. Let's begin. You've heard of the Oregon Trail. You were probably taught it in school. Brave families, manifest destiny, a path to a better life. But no one told you about the 800. Between 1852 and 1888, over 800 pioneers vanished without a trace along a stretch of trail. Just 20 miles long. They didn't die of fever. They didn't drown crossing rivers. They weren't attacked by natives. They were erased. And at the center of it all was a wooden chapel, Sacred Heart, a name chosen to disarm the fearful. A structure positioned like divine bait, at the perfect mile marker for breaking bodies and shattered hope. And inside its pews stood Father Grayson, a man whose voice could calm the dying, while he calculated the worth of their belongings. Beside him, Sister Constance, part healer, part midwife, part executioner, and Brother Ezekiel, silent, dutiful, and always one step ahead. But you need to understand, they weren't maniacs. They weren't insane. They were organized. They weren't driven by rage. They were driven by math. Every family was a transaction. Every prayer, a sedative. Every death, a decision. You see, evil in the frontier wasn't loud. It wasn't wild-eyed or ranting. It wore a collar. It carried a Bible. It told grieving parents their children had gone to glory while looting the bodies. Now, I know what you're thinking. Where were the sheriffs? Where were the marshals? Where were the preachers? They were 200 miles away. And when they came looking, years too late, the trail was cold. The graves were hidden. And the only people who ever knew were already dead. But the Graysons left something behind, not just bones. Not just jewelry. Records. Meticulous, handwritten ledgers. A name, an age, a cause of death, and a valuation. Gold coins. Copper pots, family Bibles, human lives. Appraised. One page reads, Samuel Morrison, 72, crippled hands. Died September 30th. Minimal asset retention. Purified. Purified. That was their word for murder. Not killed. Not eliminated. Purified. Because to them, it wasn't slaughter. It was sacrifice. Imagine it. You're a father. You've brought your family 1,800 miles through wind, rain, cholera, and starvation. Your child is burning with fever. And on the ridge, you see a cross. A chapel. You think God has not forgotten us. But inside that chapel is the last person you'll ever see. Father Mari would greet you with open arms, a trembling Bible, and the kind of tenderness only sociopaths can manufacture. Sister Constance would give you a tincture, blessed by herbs and holy oils. But the tingling in your throat, the numbness in your fingers, that wasn't blessing. That was arsenic. And as your vision blurred, your children screamed, and your body collapsed to the dirt. They would smile, because you weren't a person. You were a source. This wasn't murder by impulse. It was method. It was science. Ezekiel learned to spot vulnerable wagons before they ever reached the chapel. He'd scout for broken wheels, limping oxen, sobbing mothers. They wanted the ones who couldn't run, the ones too sick to leave, the ones who wouldn't be missed, The Graysons even studied scripture, not to preach it, but to weaponize it. Murray learned how to tailor his sermons to the denominations of his victims. For Presbyterians, he'd speak of God's will. For Methodists, the power of suffering. For Baptists, the reward of endurance. And when people began to die, he'd say, "The Lord tests us in strange ways, brother. Trust, endure, weep now. For joy awaits in heaven." But there was no heaven waiting. Only a pine box, a shallow grave, and the rustling sound of Ezekiel counting coins. They made it look merciful. You know what true manipulation looks like. It's not anger. It's not force. It's love. The Graysons told mothers their dying babies were being called home. They told grieving widowers their wives were chosen for greater things. They poisoned you, then offered to baptize you, and you said yes, because you had no idea you weren't the survivor. You were the next name in the book, and let me tell you something most people don't want to hear. This isn't ancient history. This isn't just about 1852, because the mechanism that made the Graysons powerful still exists, not in chapels, but in systems, in institutions that wear smiles, use holy words, promise protection while extracting everything from you. Control systems haven't disappeared. They've evolved. And if you think this is just about one murderous family, you've already missed the message. But if you're still here, then you're not like most. You're not watching for curiosity. You're watching because something inside you knows. You're being lied to. And you're ready to see. So here's your first challenge. If you've made it this far, I want you to comment this phrase twice below. To anchor what's waking up inside you. No more blind belief. No more blind belief, not for the algorithm. For your mind. So you never forget. Once your eyes open, they don't close again. The descent has only begun. In the next section, I'll show you what happened when people did try to investigate. What became of the few who asked the wrong questions. And how the Graysons learned to use the law itself as their shield. The veil tightens. You've come this far. That means you already feel it, that gnawing truth beneath your ribs, the part of you that recognizes patterns no matter how carefully they're disguised. Good, because what you're about to hear isn't simply a continuation of horror. It's the revelation of how evil, once perfected, becomes protected, hidden not by shadows, but by structure, by policy, by silence dressed in protocol. Let's return to the hills of eastern Oregon. By the time the Graysons had perfected their methods, by the time their basement was a factory of death, not faith, they had already learned the most important lesson of all. A killer with a conscience is dangerous, but a killer with legitimacy, that's untouchable. See, murderers in the woods eventually get hunted, but ministers, doctors, and caregivers, they get trusted. And that trust was what the Graysons weaponized next. It started in 1854. When a mid-ranking territorial investigator named Henry Lowell first filed a soft concern with Salem Central Magistrate. He wasn't a crusader. He wasn't looking for evil. What caught his attention were patterns. He noticed that every few months, letters would arrive in town from eastern settlers, families asking why their loved ones hadn't reached their destinations, hadn't returned word. Most of the missing were last known to be approaching the Blue Mountains, near the final stretch of the Oregon Trail. Lowell began digging. Slowly, quietly, he traveled to the last known campsites, traced wagon routes, checked logs at supply posts. And the closer he got to the Sacred Heart Chapel, the more the trail went cold. It was as if the land itself had swallowed them whole. Families vanished, and no one questioned it. No one, except him. When he finally arrived at the chapel in early spring, he found what every lost traveler found: warmth, welcome, and carefully constructed innocence. Mare Grayson greeted him with open arms, invited him to supper, even quoted scripture with a sincerity that bordered on hypnotic. Ezekiel played dumb, as always. Constance offered him tea. But Lowell wasn't an ordinary pioneer. He didn't drink the tea. He stayed 2 days asking gentle questions. Where had the Morrison family gone? What about the Hoffmans? The Keller sisters? Each time, Moray gave him the same soft explanations. They passed through in winter, poor things, sick, all of them. The Lord called them early. We buried them here and gave them Christian rites. May their souls rest. Lowell asked to see the graves. Moray agreed. They took him to the chapel yard, rows of plain wooden markers, all worn by the wind. Names etched in simple strokes. Too simple. Too clean. Lowell noticed something else. No dates. Not one. No birth. No death. No traceable record. Just names, many of them common. Easy to replicate. 100 Johns, 50 Marys. A cemetery of plausible deniability. Still, Lowell persisted. That night, while the family slept, he crept from the guest cabin and circled behind the chapel. What he found there nearly broke him. A field, fresh-turned earth, no markers, no stones. Just rows and rows of slight depressions in the soil, as though the land had been pockmarked by sorrow itself. He left before dawn, rode hard back toward the nearest town, and wrote a report. That report never made it to Salem. Lowell vanished before he reached the next settlement. His horse was found days later, wandering near a ravine. The saddlebag containing his notes was empty. The locals said he'd probably fallen, lost his footing. The trail was dangerous this time of year after all. But here's the truth. The Graysons didn't let him leave. They'd seen the change in his eyes. They'd watched him linger too long near the burial sites. They knew he'd discovered the unspoken rule of their enterprise. No one leaves who understands the pattern. Lowell wasn't the first. And he wouldn't be the last. Between 1854 and 1866, 6 separate men tried to investigate the area surrounding Sacred Heart. 2 were freelance journalists. One was a relative of a missing family. Another, a missionary of a rival sect who had heard rumors from dying travelers. All 6 vanished. One body was found, half-eaten by wolves. Another was found hanged, ruled a suicide, though his hands were bound behind his back. The others never recovered. Their names became whispers, then silence, then nothing at all. But how? How could a family of 3 hold off the law, the church, and the entire infrastructure of territorial justice? Simple, they didn't. They joined. Let me explain something most people refuse to believe. Evil doesn't always conquer by force. Most of the time, it assimilates. It moves like a virus, finding vulnerable systems, cloaking itself in their language, adopting their rituals. Until one day you can't tell the difference between the host and the parasite. The Graysons began funding the surrounding towns. Quietly, donations to churches, supplies to outposts, livestock gifted to struggling ranchers, always in the Lord's name. Always with kindness. By 1858, Father Moray had become a respected figure in local religious circles. His sermons were copied, his chapel cited in official trail maps as a place of sanctuary. The same building that reeked of death had been canonized by public trust. And as that trust deepened, the Graysons expanded. They hired help, not full-time, not permanent. Just enough to dig a few graves, fix a few wagons, carry a few crates. Drifters, immigrants, men who spoke little English, men who didn't ask questions, men who didn't live long enough to share what they'd seen. You think systems of control are always official? You think they come with uniforms and government logos? No. The deepest control is cultural. It's unconscious. It's built on one idea. Good people don't do things like that. And once the Graysons had made people believe they were good, the killings became invisible. Every suspicious death, trail sickness, every missing family, they must have gotten lost in the past. Every possession, consecrated to the Lord's work. There's a phrase Moray used to repeat in His sermons. The shepherd leads the flock with a staff in one hand and a dagger in the other. To most, it sounded poetic, biblical, but it wasn't metaphor. It was confession. A warning in plain sight. Still think this story is just about 1852? Let's come forward in time. In 1971, long after the chapel had collapsed into ruin, a team of graduate researchers from a state university stumbled upon the Grayson site during a geological survey. The lead student, a man named Paul Dunning, discovered the foundations of the chapel, including remnants of its massive stone cellar. What they found inside was beyond shocking: rusted scalpels, ceramic jars marked with faded biblical symbols, a ledger wrapped in oilcloth containing dozens of names and dates, none of which matched official trail records. The researchers took photos, samples, notes. They were never published. One of them, a young woman named Ellen Fields, went public in 1986, attempting to break the story. She was found dead in her apartment the night before her first interview. The cause? Carbon monoxide poisoning. Her stove was left on, her windows shut. A tragic accident, they said. Her notes were missing. Dunning, the team leader, disappeared entirely in 1991 while hiking alone in the Rockies. Do you see the pattern yet? Some truths don't just threaten people. They threaten entire narratives, entire belief systems, entire structures of power. And the Grayson story, if ever fully exposed, would shatter more than just a historical myth. It would expose a deeper rot, a truth most men aren't prepared to face, that institutions built to protect, sometimes devour, that what we call safety is often an illusion built on other people's silence, that faith, charity, order, all the pillars of civilization, can be hollowed out and worn like skins by predators. And those predators? They don't leave, they inherit, because after the Graysons, others came, different names, different chapels, different towns, but the same method, the same pattern, the same system. They refined the poisons, they changed the sermons, they replaced arsenic with ideology. And we never noticed, because we stopped asking questions. But not you. You're still here. That means the fog is lifting, the blinders are cracking. The descent is real. This is no longer about history. It's about now. In the next section, we'll dissect how the Graysons handed off their work to others, how their theology of death echoed into modern rituals, spiritual institutions, even corporate hierarchies. You'll see how a single chapel in the woods gave rise to a template that still shapes how you're governed today. Because if evil can put on a collar and call itself holy, what else has it put on? The town of Blackwood Hollow did what many towns do when evil passes through and leaves behind the stains of horror. They tried to bury it, not in the grave, but in memory. A mass forgetting, a collective silence, a pact of denial so deep it passed on like a generational curse. From the ashes of the Blackwood farmhouse fire, the locals attempted to rebuild, but what they could never reconstruct was the truth, what really happened inside that home, and why its surviving shadows still clung to the town's walls like soot. In the decades that followed the incident of 1878, Blackwood Hollow became something of a ghost, not because it lacked people, but because the people lacked something vital: speech. No one spoke of the four brothers. Not at the church socials. Not in the schoolhouse. Not even in whispers between lovers or around the hearth on stormy nights. It was as if they had never existed. And yet, the silence screamed louder than the fire that had once consumed their home. Local historians, who dared dig those few brave enough to flip through the censored county records or scour family Bibles for missing names, would always find strange gaps: 4 births, no deaths. 4 brothers: Daniel, Alyssa, Moses, and Abram Blackwood, born to a devout family of Baptist settlers, all of them documented by midwives, yet not a single obituary, gravestone, or funeral record exists. The only written clue left behind was the coroner's closed case file sealed in 1879 by the county judge, marked simply with the word, abominations. Over the years, researchers and journalists tried to access the file through Freedom of Information appeals, but each time the request was denied. Not lost, denied, as if someone or something still had power to keep the secrets locked away. Even more disturbing than the paper trail was the way the town's geography seemed to reject its own history. The land where the Blackwood house once stood became the only parcel that could never be resold. Developers tried to build there, once a schoolhouse, another time a general store. But each time construction began, accidents followed. One builder fell through the foundation floor and shattered both legs, claiming afterward he heard boys whispering scripture in reverse. Another suffered a stroke on site, and in his fevered rantings kept asking, "Where's the fourth? Shadow? I only see 3. Eventually, the lot was declared cursed by local pastors. Children were warned never to approach it. And by 1920, even maps of Blackwood Hollow had begun omitting the parcel entirely, as though it had slipped through the cracks of reality. The cultural amnesia surrounding the brothers extended to all aspects of Blackwood life. In the only surviving diary from that era written by a schoolteacher named Miss Henrietta Wells, there's a single entry dated April 3, 1878, just months before the fire. It reads, "The boys came again, all 4 of them. No one else seems to see the fog they bring with them." Today, the youngest stared at the wall for over an hour. When I asked what he was doing, he whispered, "God is dead. We're next." I wish I could forget. That is the final entry in her diary. After that, her journal falls silent, just blank pages, hundreds of them. Her fate remains unknown. Some say she moved away. Others say she simply vanished one night, her room left undisturbed, save for muddy footprints on the ceiling. By the 1940s, the town had built a new narrative around the site. Rumors gave way to superstition, which gave way to ritual. Every autumn, just before the harvest festival, locals would lay 4 bundles of wheat at the edge of the forbidden slot, tied with red twine, facing north. When asked why, most would shrug and say it was just old tradition. But some older residents admitted in hushed voices that the offerings weren't meant for harvest, they were peace offerings, to keep the brothers from returning. One elderly man, Samuel Harrow, who had been a boy in the 1890s, once told a traveling folklorist, "They ain't dead, not really. Their bodies maybe, but something of them stayed behind. I seen 'em once. Faces in the frost on my window, mouthing things I didn't understand, but I felt 'em. Like winter in my bones." What haunts Blackwood Hollow isn't just what happened, but the failure to name it. Every effort to push the memory underground has made the truth more twisted, more hungry. In the 1970s, a university psychologist, Dr. Elaine Monroe, conducted a series of experiments on cultural memory suppression in towns with buried traumas. Blackwood Hollow was one of her test sites. She showed residents various historic photos, including one of the original Blackwood family taken from public archives. But none of the residents could recognize the boys, even when their own great-grandparents were visible in the background. One man, a lifelong Blackwood Hollow native, became visibly agitated and began screaming, "Stop showing me ghosts," before fleeing the room. Another participant fainted upon seeing the image, and when revived, claimed he had seen the boys before, in his dreams, standing over his childhood bed, mouthing verses from Leviticus backwards. Monroe's full findings were never published. She died in a car crash less than 6 months later under suspicious circumstances. Her notes, recovered by her assistant, revealed a terrifying pattern. In towns that refused to acknowledge trauma, the trauma found new vessels, new bodies, new minds, new generations to haunt. In one margin, she scribbled a final question, never answered. What if forgetting isn't protection? What if forgetting is permission? And so, Blackwood Hollow continued to forget. Decade after decade, denial calcified into culture. The Blackwood name was scrubbed from the town's history museum. The local newspaper archives contain only a single article mentioning the family, an obituary for their father, Ezekiel Blackwood. That reads more like a sermon than a eulogy. It ends with the line, "And may the Lord deliver us from the fruit of our own blood." The brothers themselves are never named. School children grow up hearing only fragmented warnings, "Never go near the northern lot," "Never speak your prayers aloud at night," "Never answer a knock that comes in threes." But they don't know why, they just obey. Because fear doesn't need reasons, it only needs repetition. In 2006, a group of amateur paranormal investigators known as the Hollow Seekers attempted to spend the night on the forbidden slot. For a Halloween livestream, they set up infrared cameras, EMF readers, and even brought in a local priest to bless the gear. The stream started normally banter, jokes, night vision filters, but at 2:13 a.m., the feed cut to static. It remained offline for 3 days. When it returned, the only footage recovered was 17 seconds long, a single camera showing 4 shadows. Standing in the far tree line, they did not move, did not blink. Yet the audio captured 4 distinct voices, layered over each other, speaking a single phrase: "We never left. We were never allowed to." The team disbanded shortly after, citing health issues. 2 of the members later admitted to being institutionalized for auditory hallucinations. One went missing entirely, last seen walking barefoot into the woods behind Blackwood Hollow, murmuring a hymn no one could identify. Why did the town try so hard to forget? Maybe because they feared they were complicit. Maybe because the brothers weren't just victims but reflections of something the town itself had birthed. Blackwood Hollow had always been a place of strict doctrine, fire and brimstone sermons, and moral absolutism. Perhaps the brothers had been shaped not in defiance of the town but in perfect obedience to it, created by it, rewarded for following the voices in the fire. And when that obedience birthed horror, the town's only option was to turn away, to erase the mirror. But trauma is not erased, it is buried. And buried things don't die, they grow roots. They twist underground, knotting through generations, feeding on silence. By trying to forget the 4 brothers, Blackwood Hollow may have ensured they would never be released. Memory, after all, is what gives the dead peace, and in this town, there's no peace. Only rituals, warnings, and the whispered certainty that somewhere, somehow, the brothers are still watching. Some say they haunt the church steeple, appearing as 4 black birds during winter sermons. Others claim to have heard them in the static of broken radios, speaking in cryptic code. A handful believe they are not ghosts, but something worse, manifestations of an idea too twisted to name. The embodiment of what happens when innocence is punished, when truth is silenced, and when those who are different are treated not as divine mysteries, but as threats. Whatever they are, the brothers remain part of Blackwood Hollow, not in stories, but in bones, in blood, in the ground itself. And until someone dares to speak their names again, openly, honestly, they will never leave. The town, whether it knows it or not, is holding its breath, waiting, fearing, because silence, like fire, consumes everything in time. The most powerful institutions don't scream their control, they whisper it. Cloaked behind ritual, behind dogma, behind the false softness of reverence and righteousness. The deeper the people of Blackwood ventured into the embrace of the church, the more they were lulled into silence. In that silence, the truth festered like a rot under skin, hidden, spreading. Father Malachi wasn't merely a priest. He was a gatekeeper to something much older, something darker than anything the townspeople dared admit. And the church, with its tall stone arches and candlelit corridors, became more than a place of worship. It became the vault where sins were not cleansed, but stored. For generations, the Blackwood Chapel had stood atop that gentle hill, its presence as fixed as the moon. Locals believed the church brought safety, divine protection against the harsh winters and the whispers in the forest. But if you looked closely at the stained glass windows, their beauty concealed a disturbing truth. Among the saints and martyrs were figures not found in any canonical scripture. Eyes too many, wings too twisted, limbs bending in ways that human anatomy could never permit. Children were told they were artistic interpretations. But the artists who made them, they were never from town. They arrived under the cover of darkness, worked feverishly for nights, and vanished before sunrise. Not a single one was ever seen again. The church's inner chamber was always locked, always cold, always silent. Known only to clergy and the chosen few, it was called the Chamber of Veils. Behind its iron-banded doors lay relics the town wasn't allowed to see, relics the priests said were sacred. But one former altar boy, now long grown, once confessed during a whiskey-fueled breakdown that he'd snuck in once during his teens. What he saw broke something in him. He wouldn't say much. Only this: it wasn't a place for men. It was a place for remembering, something that didn't want to be forgotten. He died the following week, throat slit ear to ear. Declared suicide, but there were no ligature marks, no hesitation wounds, no blood trail. Just silence. Father Malachi, the man in black robes who ruled the town's spirit with cold precision, was always too calm, too knowing. He had arrived in Blackwood in 1838, but by 1878, 40 years later, he hadn't aged a day. His skin still smooth, his eyes bright and strange. The church ledger listed him under different names throughout the decades: Father Michael, Father Elias, Father Asher, but it was the same face, the same voice, the same slow, unsettling smile. When asked about it, he'd chuckle softly and murmur, "The Lord works in mysterious ways." And yet, the older folk whispered another explanation: that he was not chosen by God, but bound by pact. A vessel, perhaps. Or worse, a gate. The townsfolk weren't fools, but fear is a powerful leash. When a farmer's cow gave birth to a calf with a human mouth, they prayed harder. When a woman gave birth to a child who never blinked and spoke Latin in its crib, they donated more to the church. When the bell ringer's wife was found nailed to a tree with her heart missing and a rosary in her mouth, they still returned for Sunday Mass, because obedience had been carved into them over decades, not just through sermons, but through what wasn't said, through what was promised if they disobeyed. Beneath the chapel, past a series of bone-cold tunnels once thought to be wine cellars, lay something older than the church itself. Blackwood was built on something. An underground chamber shaped like a perfect circle, with 7 alcoves, each bearing a symbol no scholar could translate. When the town's founding priest, Father Bennett, discovered it in 1799, he had it sealed. But every priest since had added something to that chamber: candles, bones, books bound in skin. By the time Father Malachi arrived, it was not a sealed vault of fear. It was a throne room. And the veil, that invisible line separating the holy from the profane, had been pierced so many times it no longer existed. One rainy evening in Ivingwen, April of 1876, a young girl named Elsie witnessed something she was never meant to see. She had hidden in the chapel after dark, hoping to retrieve a doll she had dropped earlier during Mass. But what she found was not her doll. It was a procession, 7 robed figures, led by Malachi, chanting in tongues beneath the altar. They carried a bundle wrapped in cloth that pulsed as though alive. The moment Elsie gasped, the chanting stopped. Every head turned. She ran, but she didn't get far. Her body was found days later in the forest, wrapped in her own doll's dress, eyes missing. The town grieved. And yet, not a single person questioned the church, the rituals grew bolder with time. Bells would ring at midnight when no one pulled the rope. Candles would light themselves during Mass. A pulsing hum, felt more than heard, would reverberate through the pews. But Father Malachi would simply smile and say, "We are blessed." Those who disagreed, those who asked too many questions, found themselves fading from memory. Not just killed, erased. Their homes emptied. Their names never spoken again. Even the old census books had blank spaces where their records should be. The church did not need an inquisition. It needed only silence, fear, and the veil of obedience draped like a funeral shroud over every questioning heart. The children of Blackwood were perhaps the most affected. Each generation grew quieter, paler, stranger. Some were said to sleepwalk into the forest, eyes wide open, mouths whispering names that didn't belong to them. Some would wake up with bruises in the shape of hands, too large to be human, and others simply vanished. The church would claim it was tragedy, misadventure, a test of faith. But behind closed doors, some parents spoke of seeing robed men at their windows, watching, waiting, and always listening. One woman, a midwife named Agatha, tried to flee in 1877. She had seen too much. The blood-drenched linens brought secretly to her home by the nuns, the infants with eyes already clouded, the mothers who birthed things and then never spoke again. She packed her bags and took the northern trail toward Wren Hollow. She made it 3 miles. Her body was found beneath the hanging tree, every bone broken inward, as if she had been crushed from within. Around her neck, a rosary. Around her feet, the symbol from the Chamber of Veils etched into the dirt. By 1878, the year the Macabre. Brothers would make their mark. Blackwood was no longer a town. It was a congregation. The church had become the spine of every home, the shadow of every thought. What the people once called God had become something unrecognizable, something older, darker, and more demanding. And Father Malachi stood at its center like a conductor of a symphony no one could hear, only feel. The veil of obedience had become not a curtain, but a cocoon. And within it, something monstrous stirred, fed by silence, by fear, and by the blood of the forgotten. Yet not all were blind. Not all were silent. A small group, led by a blind man named Elias Dorn, a former church scribe, began to document what they could. In secret, they etched records into the wood panels of their cellar floors, into the lining of old coats, even the bark of sacred trees. They knew what the church had become. They had seen Malachi remove his collar and reveal a second mouth, hidden beneath his ribs, whispering prayers to something that didn't speak Latin or Hebrew, but hummed. They called themselves the Rememberers. They believed that if enough truth survived, something holy might rise again. But by the time the brothers returned to Blackwood in that fateful summer, only 2 of the Rememberers remained. And the church, it waited, with its candles lit, its chamber humming, its priest watching. The veil no longer kept the evil out. It kept the truth in, and those who lived beneath its shadow had long since forgotten how to look up. Look up. There are stories that whisper through the dust of time, stories that don't make it into textbooks, archives, or museums. They are buried under layers of denial, secrecy, and fear. One such story coils around the mystery of the Blackwood. Brothers, not just their deaths, but the living knowledge they were said to possess. It is here, in this tangled silence, that the story turns from a macabre tale of death into something far more disturbing, a glimpse into sciences that were never meant for public eyes. The kind of knowledge that peeks beyond the veil, that reaches into spaces where reality and nightmare overlap. The kind of science that doesn't ask for permission, and never forgives those who uncover it. In 1880s Kansas, long before digital surveillance or data trails, secrecy was easier, but so was suspicion. When 4 brothers die under strange and identical circumstances, you don't just bury the bodies. You start asking what exactly they were doing before they died. Some claimed the Blackwood farm housed more than livestock and grain. That deep beneath the barn, where no light reached and no man dared linger, strange things happened. Things involving geometry that didn't obey the laws of angles. Things involving sounds that made no sense, yet made men bleed from their ears. And worst of all, there were the notebooks bound in hide, written in codes no school had ever taught. Pages soaked in strange stains, as though they had bled the knowledge they held. Some townsfolk whispered that the brothers had discovered something older than science, something ancient that predated written history, that came not from gods, but from something beneath them. A system of knowledge pulled from symbols carved into stones found deep under their property. Symbols that changed when you looked away, that resisted translation, and yet felt instantly familiar to those who dared study them long enough. One account, from a traveling trader who stayed with the Blackwoods for a week, described a chilling evening where the brothers lit no lanterns but used mirrors to reflect moonlight into a makeshift device, a rotating lens of glass and bone. The result was not illumination, but vibration. The walls shook softly, almost rhythmically. And beneath that rhythm was something else, a whisper that wasn't quite heard, but felt in the chest, like a forgotten memory clawing its way back into the conscious mind. The trader left the next morning without breakfast, face pale and hands trembling, mumbling about something waking under the fields. It is here that we must confront a terrifying possibility, that the Blackwoods weren't inventing something. They were translating, interpreting blueprints buried long before their ancestors set foot on the continent. The stones they unearthed in the forest, some say they were not carved by human hands. Their lines too precise, their curves defying natural erosion. Others said they resembled pre-Sumerian glyphs found in the ruins of Göbekli Tepe. And yet, none of the Blackwoods ever traveled farther than 50 miles from home. So where had they seen these shapes before? And why did they repeat them obsessively in everything they built, etched into every wooden beam, stitched into every curtain, and even branded into the hides of livestock? A sheriff's deputy who investigated their home after their deaths reported something peculiar. None of the clocks in the house worked, not a single one. Each had stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m., the same hour the brothers were reported to have collapsed in synchrony. But that wasn't the strangest part. The watches and clocks brought by the deputy himself also stopped the moment he stepped over the threshold. One officer, skeptical and annoyed, brought a brand new pocket watch and entered the home with it. Ticking, it shattered in his hand 5 minutes later. Something was interfering with time inside that home. Or worse, something was unfolding time, making it misbehave. As if the very laws that governed reality bent inward at the Blackwood house. Another report, buried in a coroner's side notes and redacted in the official files, mentioned strange growth patterns in the brothers' brain stems. Anomalous tissue, dense and crystalline, unlike anything local doctors had seen. One described it as calcified intelligence, a poetic term for something neither tumor nor scar. There was speculation, quickly shut down, that the brothers had undergone self-directed neurological modification. In short, they had been experimenting on their own brains. But not with drugs or rudimentary surgery. No, they were using resonance, light and frequency. Techniques eerily similar to fringe theories developed decades later under secret military projects like Macabre and Stargate. But this was 1880. No such projects existed, at least not officially. Dig deeper and the trail gets colder. But not because it vanishes, because it was deliberately erased. The brothers' surviving documents were confiscated, some say by the army, others by men in suits who claimed to be from the Smithsonian but never returned. Neighbors who tried to speak about the case fell mysteriously ill. One went blind overnight. Another lost her speech for the rest of her life. The preacher who conducted their funeral said the sky turned an unnatural shade of violet during the service, and that he was visited in a dream by 4 shadowy figures whispering in reverse. He stopped preaching a week later and was never seen again. Why would a case like this be buried so thoroughly? Unless what the Blackwoods uncovered wasn't just dangerous but replicable. Perhaps their experiments opened something. A kind of mental channel. A vibrational key that tuned the human brain into frequencies, normally imperceptible, frequencies that weren't meant to be heard, not by us, but once heard, could never be forgotten. Several pages recovered from a nearby well believed to have been dumped during the cover-up mentioned the phrase, "consciousness is not local," a statement only decades later confirmed by the fringe edges of quantum neuroscience. Another phrase, more chilling, was etched over and over. There are patterns beneath reason, and we are made of them. It is said that the more intelligent you are, the more prone you are to madness when exposed to chaos. The Blackwoods were not just educated, they were obsessed. And maybe that obsession led them to truths that the human mind cannot safely hold. Imagine a file too large for a computer. It crashes. The Blackwoods might have opened a torrent of raw, pre-linguistic information, and their minds simply could not buffer it. One witness said the youngest brother, Eli, was found with symbols carved into his own skin, not written. Carved, as if compelled by something not external, but internal. Something trying to write itself through him. Was it possession? Or was it evolution accelerated to the point of collapse? The tragedy of the Blackwood brothers may be more than a dark tale of mystery and madness. It may be a warning, not just against curiosity, but against the wrong kind of curiosity. The kind that pokes holes in the fabric of reality to see what leaks through. In recent years, independent researchers and rogue scientists have begun revisiting the story, connecting it with similar events across the world. Families that died in perfect synchrony. Towns that reported vibrating skies before vanishing. From maps, devices found in abandoned shacks that emitted sounds which caused hallucinations in anyone who listened. And in every one of these events, the same symbols appear. Always etched into walls, scratched into trees, drawn in blood. Or coal dot, and so we must ask, did the Blackwoods really die of natural causes? Or did they touch something unnatural that left them no choice but to return to where that knowledge came from? Could their deaths have been a kind of absorption? A recollection by whatever intelligence first revealed itself to them? If there's anything that survives them, it's the idea that knowledge is not always a gift. That beneath every scientific discovery lies a darker mirror. A reflection of what happens when we are the experiment. The Blackwoods thought they were learning how the universe worked, but maybe the universe was simply watching them, waiting to see if they would open the door wide enough. And when they did, it did not knock. It stepped in. The house has long since been torn down, the fields replanted. But every now and then, birds avoid that patch of land. Clocks stop when you drive too close. Radios hiss strange rhythms when tuned near those coordinates. And sometimes, at precisely 3:33 a.m., 4 shadows appear on the edge of the field. Not moving, not breathing, just standing. As if waiting for someone to finish what the Blackwoods began. And that might be you. You.